Some of the hardest problems in the world exist far above the planet. Our job? To launch the smartest solutions, to protect our satellites, clean up our clutter, to propel breakthroughs in propulsion, to learn more about our place in the universe, to outpace emerging threats. Every day, the Aerospace Corporation uses the latest technologies to ensure our nation's safety and leadership in space.
Hi, and welcome to the Space Policy Show. We have an amazing episode for you today. As always, you can find us on Twitter using hashtag the Space Policy Show, and you can engage with us on Vimeo using the chat box. We'd also love it if you would sign up for our news alerts at aerospace.org/policy. Today's episode is on NASA's Artemis Roadshow with Mike Gold and Dr. Jim Vedda. You've probably seen Jim on some previous episodes. So welcome to this episode. We are featuring Dr. Jim Vedda, who is a senior policy analyst at the Center for Space Policy and Strategy at the Aerospace Corporation. He does policy research and analyses for various U.S. government customers that include NASA, the FAA, Department of Commerce, the Air Force, and the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. Mike Gold is currently Acting Associate Administrator for NASA's Office of International and Interagency Relations. He is also responsible for providing strategic direction to the Office of General Counsel and supporting NASA's LEO commercialization efforts. Prior to NASA, Mr. Gold was VP of Civil Space at Maxar Technologies. I'd like to go ahead and push it over to Jim to get started.
Thanks, Rebecca, for that introduction. And thank you, Mike Gold, for joining us on the show. So we're pleased to have you here and glad you were able to take out some time from your busy schedule to join us.
My pleasure, Jim. It'll be the highlight of the day.
Okay, let's see if we can make it the highlight of all of our listeners' day, too. So first of all, I think that you should explain a little bit about your position over at NASA headquarters, because I've always felt that the position that you hold of international and interagency affairs, it seems like a really broad portfolio. I mean, there's got to be a lot keeping you busy there. And I wonder if you could just give us a brief rundown of the type of things that you do for NASA and what the division of labor is between the international and the interagency.
It absolutely is a very broad portfolio. As the name indicates, we've got all of international relations, so all of our partnerships, all of our agreements with countries across the world, over 700 active international agreements. And then interagency, it's the entire federal government. So our relationship with the Department of State, with the Department of Energy, with the Department of Defense. And as space becomes more and more important to every aspect of industry in our daily lives, that interagency portion of our portfolio only continues to grow. So there's a lot to cover between the two. Then in addition, as a recovering attorney, I also have oversight over the Office of General Counsel. And candidly, it's really important that we have synergy between those three areas of international, interagency, and legal, because they're so dependent upon each other to move correctly and smartly forward.
Okay, wow, that's a lot to be put in under that one office, and good luck with that. But I also know you, and those who have known you for a long time in the space business recognize you as a longtime participant in the commercial sector, and that's what you were doing before you came to NASA, and we're seeing that the commercial sector is playing an increasingly important role in the exploration and development of space, and that's certainly true in plans for the Artemis program. So, is that push for the strengthening and growing of the U.S. commercial space sector something that you get involved in directly in your office? I mean, do you deal with this issue in interactions with, say, Department of Commerce, Department of Transportation, the FCC? Is that something, that commercial aspect that you grew up with in this industry, an important part of what you're doing today?
Absolutely. And not only with the interagency, but the international. NASA has been incredibly successful with the public-private partnership paradigm. It's now in the NASA DNA. and is benefiting not only the agency, but the nation and the world as a whole with these commercial innovations and capabilities that are frankly making the world a better place and reducing everything from famine and hunger around the world with our Earth observation commercial capabilities to creating lower costs for launch and bringing the entire commercial launch market from overseas to American shores. And particularly as you look at our interagency relationships, say with a organization like the Department of Transportation, because these launches, and Crew One was the first example of this, are taking place under license by the FAA, we have to have a very close relationship with them. And the exciting part is we are just at the beginning of the commercial space revolution. And particularly as we talk about PAM missions, private astronaut missions that are going to occur to the International Space Station, while it's been extremely exciting to see commercial crew capsules launching on behalf of NASA, it will be equally exciting to see those same commercial crew capsules launching on behalf of private sector entities for the first time. And the regulatory structure of that, which needs to be efficient, which needs to be effective, will be developed in part by NASA and the FAA Office of Commercial Space Transportation working together. Similarly, with Department of Commerce working on their regulatory activities for all kinds of amazing capabilities, from future private sector space stations to commercial lunar landers, and the Department of Defense, which is also taking advantage of this commercial paradigm to be a customer for services rather than have to pay for them. This commercial partnership runs through every aspect of what we do. And as I mentioned previously, even with international, as we look at the Gateway, which is an orbital outpost that will be around the moon and provide the cornerstone of sustainability for the Artemis program, there the Gateway logistics resupply services will be provided by a commercial provider. We've got commercial companies working on the first habitat and the power and propulsion elements. So there is no aspect of what we do that isn't positively impacted by the public-private partnerships. So I'm very much still in the same space I always was, just wearing a different jacket, as you can see.
Yes, we see that. And what I wonder is if you could tell us a little bit about the recent awards that NASA made to 4 companies to collect some lunar samples and then transfer the ownership of those samples to NASA after collection. Can you elaborate a little bit on what the purpose of that project is and how it ties into what you just said?
Absolutely. And let me begin with the importance of space resources. Space resources are the fuel that will carry NASA and all of humanity to the stars and allow us to stay there. That we must be able to conduct in situ resource utilization, ISRU, to be able to live off the land and be able to collect water, air, even fuel from the surface of the moon and later on Mars. Jim, do you go camping at all? Are you a camper?
I am not.
Well, if you were, and if you've ever gone, I can tell you that taking, if you had to, all of your air with you, all of your water with you, all of your food, all of your heat, it would be very, very difficult. So whether it's a camping trip or exploration, and particularly when it comes to space exploration, you have to be able to extract and utilize those resources. And that's going to be important to creating a sustainable and permanent human presence on the moon, and will be even more important as we go forward to Mars and mount a historic first human mission to Mars, where the challenges technologically will be even greater. And I think ISRU and space resource utilizations is also an excellent example of how important the moon to Mars strategy is. The question should never be moon or Mars, it's moon and Mars. And with space resources and this recent award, you see how we're going to develop technologies and capabilities and business relationships on the surface of the moon that we can then extend to Mars to support innovative and historic Martian exploration. What this program also did was extended the public-private sector partnership paradigm, say that quickly 3 times, to the moon, that we have been so successful with public-private partnerships, as is evidenced by the launch of Crew via our commercial partnership program, and Cargo, which has been carried to the ISS by commercial partners for now almost a decade. Instead of building our own systems with this procurement, you see NASA acting as a customer and purchasing services from the private sector. So we hope to leverage the efficiencies, the innovation, and the creativity of the private sector to help us go to the moon to stay.
Well, I'm right with you there on the space resources issue. If you can't go live off the land, that severely limits what we're going to be able to do in exploration and development. It limits you to something like a lunar version of an Antarctic research station, and we want to go beyond that. But let me move from there. That's a good segue into the Artemis Accords, which we're going to spend some time talking about here. And I have to start by asking you, now, I know what a huge Star Trek fan you are. So I have to wonder, did you want to call these the Kittimer Accords so that you can name them after the peace treaty between the United Federation of Planets and the Klingon Empire?
Well, the Klingons aren't available to sign the Artemis Accords, but if we could, I would certainly offer it up. And you've broken the code relative to names, but let me say that there is a Star Trek connection in that you say the story of the Kittimer Accords, which, for those of you who actually dated or did other things in high school rather than just sit and watch Star Trek episodes, was the treaty that brought the Klingon Empire and the United Federation of Planets together. The Accords are very much in that spirit, where it's trying to bring the countries together, working on the Artemis program and the whole world to support principles that will allow for the safe, transparent, peaceful, and prosperous exploration of the moon, Mars, and beyond.
Okay, so if we look at the content of the Accords, we see a lot of reference to the Outer Space Treaty, the Registration Convention, the Assistance Agreement, also known as the Rescue and Return Agreement, UN guidelines on orbital debris. These types of agreements that we're all very familiar with and have been around for some time. And the Accords seem to want to pledge some reassurances that the participants will abide by these existing agreements. So so much bulk of the language of the Accords refers back to these things. Is the primary purpose of the Accords, or one of the primary purposes, the reaffirmation of existing agreements and the encouragement of more countries to adhere to them?
It absolutely is. And not only reaffirming the principles of the Outer Space Treaty, the Registration Agreement, the Agreement on the Rescue of Astronauts, but implementing those principles, operationalizing the Outer Space Treaty. While COPUOS, Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, and the United Nations did their job to craft these multilateral agreements, it's now incumbent upon NASA and its partners to take those agreements and ensure that as we move forward to the moon with the Artemis program, that all of our activities and our partner activities are conducted in compliance with those treaty obligations. You can't just take the Outer Space Treaty and give it to the NASA Human Exploration Operations Mission Directorate and say, do this. And that's the purpose of the Artemis Accords, to translate those obligations to ensure full compliance with our existing obligations. And then there's also norms of behavior that we traditionally practice at NASA that are very important to put forward, that are not necessarily literally part of the treaty, but very much in the spirit of the Outer Space Treaty and the other multilateral agreements, such as the full, free, and public release of scientific data. We want the whole world to be able to join us on the Artemis journey. And through the public release of scientific data, anyone with an internet connection will be able to benefit from the awe-inspiring science and the wonders that we will discover via the Artemis journey. Additionally, interoperability. It's something that isn't explicitly part of the Outer Space Treaty, but the more interoperable systems are, the better that we're going to be able to do to create an environment that is conducive and encourages not only international collaboration, but private sector activities and private sector investment. And when it comes to the agreement on the rescue of astronauts, the more interoperable our systems are, the more efficient, the more effective, and the safer our activities will be when trying to rescue an astronaut in distress. So that's what we're trying to do with the Artemis Accords, to implement those obligations, to reaffirm our commitments to those treaties, and to push forward with norms of behavior that we have traditionally practiced that are so important to achieving that peaceful future that we all want to see. We want that future to be less Star Wars and more Star Trek.
Okay, good way of putting it. So we have a very rich background in all of those treaties and agreements that we've just been talking about, and calling upon those in the Accords brings up this whole history and a great familiarity throughout the space community. But there are a couple of things that are new, relatively new introductions in the discussion of within these Accords. And I noticed that in 3 places in the Accords, there is the statement inserted that goes like this: the signatories intend to use their experience under the Accords to contribute to multilateral efforts to further develop international practices and rules for some specific area. So that is used 3 times in reference to space resources, in reference to preserving space heritage, and in the section on deconfliction. So those sections really need a lot more fleshing out, it would seem, because there's details that still need to be worked out. Is the language in the Accords that I just quoted, is that a marker for future actions by the signatories to further develop the detail behind these particular relatively new concepts?
It absolutely is a marker. And it's also an example of how the Accords are a beginning to a discussion, not an ending. We have so much more to learn. Maybe a decade or so ago, we thought the moon was bone dry. Now we know that there are vast amounts of water ice on the moon. And Sophia recently discovered water molecules on the sunlit side. We have yet to even scratch the surface of the amazing discoveries that we're going to have on the moon. And therefore, I think we need to be modest as NASA and really as humanity relative to the fact that we are going to encounter surprises, new environments, new discoveries that will drive operations in ways that candidly we probably can't even imagine right now. And that's why we took a page from the Outer Space Treaty. And let me go back to the Outer Space Treaty for a moment. The Outer Space Treaty is a treaty of principles. It was not prescriptive. Instead, the Outer Space Treaty lays out general goals and objectives. And because of that, it's as relevant today as it was when it was executed in 1967. The Outer Space Treaty is over 50 years old, doesn't look a day over 30. And it's because it deals in principles rather than in specific details. And then it allows each country to move forward and implement and achieve those goals in whatever ways it sees fit. And with the Artemis Accords, while we wanted to provide a modest step forward, another degree of fidelity to help with the planning of Artemis activities. The Accords mirrored the principles of the Outer Space Treaty. The Accords are also a document of principles because, again, we don't know what we're going to encounter. And the Accords, by being principles and the references that you mentioned, we acknowledge the fact that good laws and good specific regulations can only come from actual experience. If you try and create detailed regulations and legal policies before you gain experience in that environment, that's when there's going to be problems, trouble, and frankly, bad policy. Good policy is driven by good experience. And that's why we reference in the Accords that we will be taking what we learn from operating on the lunar surface and elsewhere to inform discussions at the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space and other international forums where we are ultimately going to be discussing more detailed rules and regulations and norms of behavior for the environment on Moon, Mars, and everything in between. So again, this is part of the beginning of a discussion, not an ending. And maybe just to give an example of that, let's go to the Accords principle of protecting space heritage. There we don't say that you need to stay 10 feet or 20 feet away from a space heritage artifact or site. Instead, we state the principle, and that will be enough for NASA and its partners to plan not to create any kind of harm with a historic site. And then we can take our experience in attempting to implement that principle to the United Nations, to other international forums, to help then craft potentially more detailed rules, policies, guidelines for the future. So that's absolutely what we're trying to accomplish. Again, the Artemis Accords are the beginning of a journey, not an ending.
So you're specifying a future intention to develop this much further, and you said you were not at this point saying you have to stay X number of feet away from the Apollo 11 lander. So there also has to be some procedure developed in how you determine what qualifies as a historic site. And obvious ones like the Apollo 11 landing sites would be no question, but there are going to be others. And that part of the discussion is one you're leaving until later?
So we're keeping it at a high level for now. And the language of the Accords relative to protecting heritage sites are broad, that we in no way, shape, or form wanted to limit ourselves to just human spaceflight heritage sites. There are many sites involving robotic craft that are significant historic artifacts and significant historic sites. So if any human created craft or mark has historic value, we want to protect that. So generally, the Accords will do so. We do address that issue, and we and our partners will abide by that. We will protect space heritage sites on the Moon, on Mars, and everywhere in between. But as you point out, we could have spent dozens of pages defining exactly what is a historic artifact, what is a historic site, and how far you should stay away. Instead, we wanted to proceed with the general principle that we should do no harm to those sites. We will ensure that we don't as we proceed with the Artemis program, and then we'll take the experiences. So if we stayed a certain distance away and that was effective in preventing harm to the site, if we took certain measures to prevent harm to a historic artifact, we will take those experiences to help inform future dialogue and potentially future rules and guidelines that will be developed by other multilateral forums. Again, it's so valuable bringing that good experience to inform good policy and good law.
So let's look at another aspect that was introduced here that may have some questions in the minds of observers who are reading this in the Accords. The issue of safety zones, which is in the section dealing with deconfliction. So the establishment of safety zones is something that in the national security community has been talked about for a long time. Should there be keep out zones around vital satellites, for example? And it's been very controversial about whether it was legal to do that, whether it would be effective at all, and how big do you make the keep out zones? Well, now it seems like this safety zone issue in the Accords has brought that up again. There are more questions coming out of this that will need to be answered. Like, for example, are you referring to safety zones just on planetary surfaces or at orbital locations as well? Are these trying to cover various types of physical interference, or is electromagnetic interference also covered by this? Could you lend some clarity to the safety zone concept?
Sure thing. And as a recovering attorney, let me begin by emphasizing the importance of nomenclature, because we have to be very careful of conflating safety zones with exclusionary zones or keep out zones. As I mentioned previously, fundamentally, the Artemis Accords are designed to prevent conflict and to prevent that conflict before it happens. So much conflict here on Earth is caused by misperceptions and confusion. So, one of the greatest tools that we have to prevent conflict is transparency. And that's where the safety zone begins. That if a country is conducting an operation, for example, on the surface of the moon, that nation must notify the United Nations and the public where that country is operating and basically what they're doing. And let me use the example of a rover. So if a nation has a rover and that rover can move, say, 10 kilometers, and if there was some sort of off nominal event, there could be debris that might spread 20 kilometers. The safety zone would be the area in which harmful interference could occur. For those of you who are familiar with the Outer Space Treaty, it prohibits harmful interference. So, this is a great example of how the Artemis Accords implement an obligation of the Outer Space Treaty. How do we prevent harmful interference as required by the treaty? And the answer is safety zones, where within those zones, the country is required to do two things: identify again the area where harmful interference could potentially occur, and share that with the United Nations and with the world. And after transparency and informing the public where and how a country is operating, then you need to coordinate. So the Outer Space Treaty requires free use and access for everyone on a celestial body, and therefore there's the potential of another country entering the safety zone. And within that safety zone, the Accords require coordination to avoid harmful interference, which in the end is just countries talking to each other. It's consultation as described by the Outer Space Treaty. So far from excluding any countries or parties from a safety zone, the Artemis Accords actually anticipate entities entering safety zones, which is why we're requiring coordination as well as the transparency to prevent conflict before it occurs. Relative to geography, if I can use that word in this context, it doesn't matter whether an activity is on the surface of the moon, orbiting the moon, on Mars, the surface of Mars, or elsewhere in cislunar or cismartian space. You still need to avoid causing harmful interference. The safety zones still need to be respected. And again, this is an example of why the Artemis Accords and the Outer Space Treaty are so effective by utilizing principles instead of being prescriptive. Because it would be very difficult to have a single standard that would apply to the lunar surface, to orbit around the moon, and to Mars. Those are all extremely different environments. But the principle of the safety zone remains the same no matter where you are, that you need to notify the area where harmful interference could occur, and you need to coordinate. So that remains true regardless. That's the power of the safety zone. Again, an excellent example of how the Accords implement the obligations of the Outer Space Treaty to create the peaceful future that we all want and deserve.
So an example might be in some future point where there's a mining operation on the moon. That we're going to be blasting next Tuesday, so everybody stay outside of this 10-kilometer radius. That'd be a worthwhile example.
So I do want to say a word about mining and space resources now that you raise it, but it would be an example to the extent that we need to be transparent relative to what activity is occurring, any dangers or threats it could create to others. So that much is true. But I do think you have to be careful that, again, per the Outer Space Treaty, the safety zones are not designed, and they would violate the Outer Space Treaty if you tried to transform them into a keep out zone or a stay out zone. So it's very important, again, that you understand, those watching this video, that the Artemis Accords create a safety zone to achieve what the name says, to ensure safety. So your example is true to the extent that you are being transparent relative to an activity, the kind of activity, so that you can maintain transparency. And since you bring up the mining example, again, we want to encourage the ability to extract and utilize space resources. That's going to be vital to the sustainable space exploration for NASA, its partners, and the world, to be able to explore and permanently live and work on celestial bodies. But it's also important for safety, that if you think about being trapped in a remote location where you can't just order the pizza or go around to the corner store, the ability to be able to obtain air, water, fuel from the environment that you're in could literally save lives down the road. And that aspect of ISRU relative to bolstering safety, I think, is something that we don't talk often enough about. So yes, extracting and utilizing space resources is going to be vital. It's why we move forward with the commercial purchase. And we hope that companies will invest in the infrastructure to be able to extract those resources so that NASA and others can be a customer for purchasing those resources that we can utilize, again, extending public and private partnerships out to the moon, Mars, to benefit from the creative innovations for all of our exploration and utilization activities.
So it sounds like there's going to be an abundance of additional agreements that will spring forth from all of this to try and make sure there's not duplication of efforts, for example, to maximize the scientific objectives, who's going to build the habitats, who's going to provide the rovers. So I suppose it would be fair to say that we could be talking about dozens or even hundreds of agreements springing forth from this to spell out all the specifics of who's going to do what.
Well, there will certainly be many agreements, but they can all fall under the auspices of the Artemis Accords. And let me take a step back and just say a word about the Artemis program, because you can't get to the Artemis Accords without the Artemis program. And I'm sure probably everyone watching and listening knows, but just to repeat, Artemis is NASA's initiative to put the first woman and the next man on the moon, and to create a permanent and sustainable presence on the moon to learn new technologies, new techniques, and to develop the systems that we need to mount a historic first human mission to Mars. And like any program, we are going to have international partnerships. And there's a lot of differences between Artemis and Apollo, which I think are good to tease out because they, really reveal the nature of what we're doing. We all applaud and honor what was achieved with the Apollo missions, but a flaw in Apollo, to the extent there was one, is that it ended. And Artemis is designed to be sustainable. And that's why we've spent so much time talking about space resources. And space resources are a key to that sustainability. But another piece of sustainability are international partnerships. That space is so challenging and dangerous and expensive that it forces us to come together as a world to be able to tackle these problems. And Artemis will be the largest and most diverse human space exploration coalition in history. So, as you mentioned, there are going to be many agreements that we execute. Artemis has been very popular. The Moon to Mars strategy has not only received bipartisan support and united different people and different parties here in America, but really has helped unite the world. That we have received numerous inquiries and interest from international partners to participate in the Artemis program. And the Accords are that vehicle to do so. That the administrator wanted us to leverage the popularity of Artemis to be able to achieve consensus on these norms of behavior that are so important to guarantee a future that is peaceful and prosperous. But that's just the first part of the Accords. The second part are implementing agreements or MOUs that will be executed underneath or in parallel with the Accords, wherein international partners will provide contributions to the Artemis program. And that's where we will avoid duplication and ensure that all of the contributions are complementary and help emphasize and reinforce anything that we're doing so that we can create this grand global coalition to explore the mysteries of the moon and go on to Mars. So we definitely expect many, many more agreements to be executed. It's countries signing on to the principles of the Accords. And then there will be individual agreements with each underneath the auspices of the Accords that allow those contributions to take place. Let me also say that one aspect about the Accords, while the principles are multi-country, if not multilateral, where all of the countries are agreeing to the same text, the same principles, which of course is very important, the bilateral aspect of the Accords are that contribution, that each country will be making their own unique contribution to the Artemis program. And that allows us to have a much broader coalition than ever before. If you look at the International Space Station, the IGA, the Intergovernmental Agreement, which is the legal framework for the ISS, it's very challenging to bring new countries into that agreement. With the Artemis Accords, you can have a country like Japan that has or is contemplating a very substantial contribution to the Accords via the pressurized rover that will be built by Toyota that will help us to explore the moon. That will be a multi-billion-dollar effort. On the other hand, you might have a smaller country that is getting into space for the first time. We've had a great growth of the number of space agencies throughout the world, and a smaller nation or developing nation might only be able to contribute some scientists or professors to analyze lunar data. But no matter how large or no matter how modest your contribution, there is a place for you in the Artemis program. And that's what the Artemis Accords were designed to deliver, that broad coalition of nations to represent the largest and most diverse human space exploration coalition in history.
Wow, that sounds great. So obviously this is not your grandfather's NASA here. This is things that are doing much different in their approach than we saw back in the Apollo era. So let me ask you, while we've been talking a little bit about the use of space resources, about an executive order that the president signed in April of 2020 with the title Encouraging International Support for the Recovery and Use of Space Resources. And in that executive order, there was a tasking for the State Department to report back to the White House in 6 months on their efforts to encourage international support for the public and private recovery and use of resources in space through joint agreements and bilateral and multilateral arrangements with foreign states. Okay, so 6 months have passed already. I haven't heard anything more on this. Are you familiar with this? Were you involved in this? Is there a report from the State Department that talks about the use of space resources and the international cooperation aspect?
So actually, you have heard of some of the activities that were in that report. We were just discussing them. The commercial purchase of lunar resources is a good example of what was in the report. That report was developed by state, but it was really gathering all of the activities that were being conducted, not only by the Department of State, but by NASA, the Department of Commerce, and others to move forward with space resource utilization. So our commercial purchase, and particularly the international aspect, where we had awards not only to US companies, but to an entity in Luxembourg and an entity in Japan, were examples of what was in the report and the different agencies and departments supporting the goals of the executive order. Beyond that, the Department of State has been working on norms of behavior and to ensure compatibility between different regulatory regimes. There's been a lot of discussions about how we can sync up regulations between different nations to again achieve an environment that's more conducive to private sector growth and development and protecting the safety of everything from the moon to prevent harmful biological forward and backward contamination, protecting the earth in the case of backward contamination, as well as to, again, create an environment that's conducive to private sector growth. Beyond that, again, sticking with regulatory issues, you see the Department of Commerce moving forward with creating a regime for dealing with Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty, which requires nations to provide authorization and continuing supervision for their private sector activities. If we're going to be successful with public-private partnerships, with pure commercial activities in space, we need to provide certainty. We need to provide predictability for investments, for insurers to take place. And it's been terrific to see Department of Commerce and Department of Transportation working internally and with international partners to help achieve that transparency, that certainty, that predictability that we need for public and private activities. So that's the kind of information that was in the report that state put forward. It's been terrific, the progress that we have all made. But as we've noted before, we're just at the beginning. We have so much more to do, and it's a challenge, but it's incredibly exciting.
Wow, a lot happening. So is that State Department report publicly available?
I don't know. You would have to go to Department of State for that. But I can tell you that a lot of the substance of that report has already been public, like our commercial purchase of lunar resources, the Artemis Accords, and other international outreach efforts.
Okay, in the time that we have left, there's one more question we have to talk about that we can't really avoid when we talk about the Artemis Accords. There have been some international objections to the Accords. Specifically, we've seen reporting on what the Russians have said, and the Russians are our space station partners. So could you tell us about some of the objections that have been raised internationally about the Accords? Who's making the objections, and what is it that NASA has to do to respond, if anything, to these objections to ensure the success of the Accords?
So I don't even think we have objections. We just have opportunities for better communication. As a matter of fact, I think most of the objections that you've heard from the Russians or others are based on misperceptions and a lack of information. As you mentioned, I came from the private sector, and what was challenging for me, particularly as we developed the Accords, is that you go through something called the C-175 process, which is an interagency review of a effort and agreement like the Accords, and you have to gain government permission before you move forward and discuss it publicly. Unfortunately, as often occurs, news about the Accords leaked. And prior to our public rollout of the Accords on May 15th, there was some media stories that ran that candidly had information that was flat out wrong or created misperceptions relative to the Accords that the Russians and a few others reacted to. Subsequent to May 15th, when we were able to describe what we wanted to do with the Accords and went public with the summary of the principles of the Accords, and even more once we were able to release the text of the Accords, many of those objections have been diluted, if not eliminated. As a matter of fact, some who were initially critical have become great supporters of the Accords once they were able to read the text. And an example of that is the Russians, that initially there was skepticism driven by bad information in media. But once we released the summary on May 15th, there was actually a very good article in TASS where my counterpart in Russia complimented the Accords as an opportunity to come together. Now, I do want to clarify that the Accords are a means, as I've said before, to implement international obligations for NASA in executing the Artemis program and our partners as we move forward with Artemis. So if you're not a country that is participating in Artemis, as Russia is not at this moment, it's certainly not necessary for them to sign the Accords, because if you're not part of Artemis, then you don't have to worry about abiding by the multilateral agreements as you implement. That being said, we wrote the Accords to be inclusive so that any country could and should follow the principles of the Accords. We wanted to lead by example, to embrace values such as the public release of scientific data, interoperability, deconfliction of activities, due regard. These are all principles that we follow and we want others follow. So even for those countries that aren't signing the Accords, we hope that they will follow our example, and that's the best that we can do. We can embrace our values, show the world what responsible operations look like, and hopefully thereby create a global consensus that will give us the peaceful and prosperous future that avoids conflict so we can do better in space than we have here on Earth.
Well, thanks for this discussion. You've brought a lot of clarity to the Artemis Accords. You've told us about all of the activities that are going on and are anticipated that will be connected to the Artemis program and the Accords. And you've given us yet another example of the way that NASA as an organization is maturing in its role in the ongoing adventure of the exploration and development of space. It's something that we're all of us space advocates are happy to see, and we feel enlightened, Mike. So thanks for coming, and we hope we'll be seeing you again. And with that, we'll say farewell and hand it back to Rebecca.
Thank you, Mike and Jim, for a great discussion. And thank you to our production team, James Liggins and Sarah Pannoni, located in the Los Angeles area. As always, check us out on Twitter using hashtag The Space Policy Show, and sign up for our latest news alerts at aerospace.org/policy. We will be taking a break next week and back on December 31st for a 2021 strategic look ahead with Aerospace's lead futurist, Kara Kunzeman. Until then, see you next time and stay safe.